My name is Stewart Copeland, and I did the music for the second Highlander film. Unfortunately, Russell hired someone else for the first one, but he came to his senses the second time around. The music for this piece had to be timeless. It really had to be an orchestra because orchestral film scores are timeless. You can do more with an orchestra than you can with electric guitar, because as soon as you hear an electric guitar, you're dated. You've set yourself in a place and time. Whereas the orchestra applies to all things, all life, all time. Although this is technically a science fiction piece, it didn't feel so much like science fiction. It felt like more of a period piece. And the period is way in the future. This story has a lot of weight. It's about the hugeness of time in its immense eternity. I didn't have too much cause for ukulele. It was all pretty big brass, big, huge choir as well. I suppose another way of gone would be to play quiet little poignance against the huge drama of it, but screw that, you know, more is better. In approaching a score like this, the inspiration was not so much other film composers as other orchestral composers. Starting the film off with Wagner immediately sets a tone, and so I went into the deep Germanic as far as the orchestral style of it. The score that I wrote is orchestrated very much in the same way that Wagner's music was. A lot of brass, light on the top strings, more violas and celli than violins, you know. The opening scene takes place in an opera in Buenos Aires with Wagner playing. And it kind of segues into this battle scene, and it was just perfect because the aria that she's singing, I was able to get that right into the big battle scene of Valhalla going up in flames. It was a great pleasure to find the score of Götterdämmerung and then build from there, and then move the direction that the film moved and come with other stuff, and gradually the Wagner falls away and humble Copeland takes over. Every composer lives to score a scene such as the one where the two guys fight it out on the flying skateboards. It's mainly music, and the music has to feel like the rush of the wind and the fast motion that's fluid. That's a very fun musical opportunity to have a scene like that. With, you know, images like that, it's just fun to watch guys, you know, flying around on those skateboards. I attacked this score with great energy and enthusiasm because the fight scenes, the sword fighting, were very rhythmic. And I got obsessed with it, and I learned a big lesson, which is to not do that. I scored these sword fighting scenes to the frame, and I had to think of musical reasons why they're going to da-da-dun, da-da-dun, yeah, dun, 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 da. And I had to find a musical envelope to go around all of these very percussive effects. Well, the problem with those percussive effects was that it's a sword fighting movie, not a sword fighting musical. And so when it came time to mix the film, the sound that you actually hear in the film is the sounds of blades of steel clanging. And the beautiful music that I scored this through kind of got munched by the sound effects. The score was composed on a Fairlight computer, which is a totally redundant dinosaur by now. And it basically is a computer which has two sides to it. One side is that it has samples of all these different sounds. A flute, it has a sample of every note of a flute and every note of a piano and all these samples of things that you can create facsimiles. You can create a fake flute passage. And the other thing the computer does is that as you play music into it and you write it, you record the notes, you record your bass line, and it turns what you played into a page of music, so you can give that to a bass player. People say, what would Mozart have written if he had had all this technology? And the answer is probably the same thing, but he probably would have gotten there a little quicker. This computer would generate a facsimile of the sound so that I could have my big brass fanfare and kind of have an idea of how that's going to play against the picture, so that when I take it and put it in front of a real orchestra, I've already heard what it's going to sound like. So it takes a lot of the mystery and worry and anxiety out of the scoring date. Also, the computer has certain musical qualities of its own. The orchestra is great for this dramatic sweep and this fluid kind of natural sound, but there's something that you get from that hard, rigid computer rhythm, which kids these days dance to like maniacs. There's something about that rhythm that gets you in its grip, and there's certain things that machines can do that an orchestra just cannot do, and in Highlander there's a combination of both. I also picked up a lot of chops working with a non-session player orchestra, a sitting orchestra that's a real orchestra where these guys all play together every day. I learned the value of that over the value of the exactitude of execution, which is what you get from the LA Union players. We scored this film up in Seattle with the famous Seattle Symphony. It's an orchestra that records albums. It does Brahms, Mozart, Wagner. I mean, it does the Warhorse art pieces. They're not used to getting a new chart that they've never seen before. They play in an ensemble way. You get kind of more emotional impact from the performance, and emotional impact is really what the score is all for. And I think we were the first people to go up to Seattle to use the Seattle Symphony. And in fact, we had such a good time up there, they invited me back to do a concert up there one day. So I'm like that with the Seattle Symphony. In olden times, the orchestra used to be the score, and that's it. They'd record the orchestra straight onto this 2-inch mag tape that looks like film. They get their whole sound on the stage, and then they just get a few microphones to get that on tape as it is. They don't have any intention of changing the mix, making the flutes a little bit louder or the bass a little heavier. But since I come from the rock and roll recording world, we don't record it in one day, we record it over a month. And so this was kind of a combination of the two, where I'd record the orchestra, but I recorded onto multi-track so that I could goose the bass. I could put them through technology and treat them separately from the flutes. The orchestral recordists were driven nuts by the needs that I had for separate, discrete sections of the orchestra. And the rock and roll recordists that I had operating the other end of the machinery were frustrated by these guys from the dark ages, you know. It was kind of a meeting of two worlds, and the recording process involved in those two different kinds of music took some ironing out. The biggest challenge of this film is the amount of music. I think this film goes down in my career record for being the only film I've ever done where I think there's actually more music than there is footage. The score is longer than the movie. I think this is the only time I've ever done that.